also very delighted to introduce our speaker tonight, and she's the inaugural speaker of the series. I could not have found a better speaker for this year, inaugural speaker for this year, because of the topic and because of her expertise and because of her accomplishments. So Kathleen Wilson is now currently a visiting distinguished professor of philosophy at the City University of New York. She has taught and held research fellowships in Germany, Britain, and Canada, including the University of Aberdeen, where she was formerly Regius Professor of Moral Philosophy. She's the author of 7 books on philosophy and its history, including Epicureanism and the Origins of Modernity, The Invisible World, Philosophers and the Microscope, and of course, most recently, Epicureanism for the how to be an Epicurean and so on in the modern world, which I just finished reading, by the way, an incredible book. She has 2 children and lives in London and New York. So please help me welcome Catherine to the podium.
Well, thank you, Anouar. It's a pleasure to be here, my first time in Portland. And I look forward to telling you not quite everything I know about Epicureanism, but what I hope you'll find most interesting and maybe most relevant for these times about one of my favorite philosophies. So I'll start off by talking about Epicurus and Lucretius. Epicurus is the 3rd century Athenian philosopher, after whom Epicureanism is named. He had a kind of cult-like school of philosophy located in what's called the garden. Gardens in ancient times didn't have flowers, so you could think of it more like a grove with a communal mansion in the middle where the Epicureans took their meals together and discussed philosophy and walked around, I suppose. Lucretius comes along 2 centuries later, the Roman poet, and what he does is set into verse a book of Epicurus's called On Nature. The actual book of On Nature by Epicurus was lost. It got buried along with a lot of other Epicurean manuscripts in the eruption of Vesuvius. And gradually people are digging up these scrolls, which have been badly burned and even devoured by mice and things that happen over time, and unrolling them and discovering what the actual text of On Nature was. But still, it's very gappy, and Lucretius's beautiful poem is really the best account we have of it. Since I don't like, and this is unusual for philosophers, I don't like to put a lot of text up on PowerPoints, but I do have pictures, and I do have little samples of Lucretius's poetry. So here we have what I think, this is an 18th century illustration to De Natura Rerum Libris 6, that's the 6 books of Lucretius's On the Nature of Things, which is the title he gave to Epicurus's book. But that's Epicurus receiving the wreath of, I think, the muse of Lucretius, and down at his feet are the dragon of superstition that, according to Lucretius, Epicurus crushed, liberating humanity from fear and anxiety. So here we have a crowned, and again, very 18th century looking Epicurus here, looking up at, that is supposed to be the sun, and what he's looking at are motes in a sunbeam, which I'm sure you've all seen coming through the window. And this is a reference to one of the most common analogies for what the atoms are like. The atoms of Epicurus which he claimed were the basic elements of the universe, the only indestructible things, eternally existing, and the components of everything else. The atoms, he thought, Epicurus, were tiny particles with no color, no taste, no scent. They came in an infinity of different shapes, but very small sizes, below the threshold of perception. So these motes were just to be understood as like them, but not as atoms themselves. And the argument for them was that something must be permanent in the universe. Everything else that we see is destructible. This building will one day no longer stand here. It'll be a pile of rubble, and eventually that will disappear. Mountains, oceans, those will disappear too. Our cosmos will disappear. We're going to be sucked into the black hole at the center of the galaxy in some many billions of years. But the Epicureans reasoned that there must be something indestructible, or there would be nothing to build the world out of. And that was the atom, the uncuttable thing. So Epicurus said, the totality is made up of atoms and void, and beyond those two things, nothing can be conceived. Nothing really exists. There are different cosmoi made up of atoms, different cosmoses, I suppose we would say. They have their own suns, moons, stars, animals, and plants, but they are inaccessible to us. Still, ours is only one, and ours too is finite, of course. So as Lucretius puts it, and here I've used a 19th century translation, not exactly a rhyming translation. I think this is a blank verse translation. The same elements constitute the air, the sun, the earth, and animals and plants. As in our verse, we many letters see, common to many words. So the idea was that as you can make up not quite an infinite number of words. Well, if you can make them infinitely long, you can. You can make up a very, very large number of recognizable words from the same combination of letters. You could make up all the things in the visible world from combinations of atoms. And these things would have the kind of sense and meaning that a word has as opposed to a letter. So scent and taste and all qualities have to depend on small particles and the way they're arranged. Even consciousness, mind, depends on material particles. Epicurus thought that there were tiny, very mobile, very swift-moving atoms that constituted the mind. These were spread throughout the body, not just in the brain. And that's why you were able to move and feel and have thoughts and experiences and emotions and sensations. All of this was influential on early modern science when Epicurus and Lucretius were rediscovered, for the most part, in the 15th century. And our modern atomic theory can be traced back step by step to the recovery of ancient atomism, even though their atoms were, of course, very different from ours today. So why did they think that, that the world must be made of atoms and nothing else? This was really a very unusual thought for the ancients, because most ancient theories are hierarchical, top-down. There is some kind of creator, certainly gods, or some kind of animated force of the universe that directs things that go on below. That's certainly the case in Aristotle. There's a supreme intelligence, and then a whole hierarchy of subsidiary intelligences until you get down to our world, which is governed by the ones above. In Plato, you have the forms, which are very abstract, incorporeal, but somehow also very powerful. And here you have a system that's just built up from below. And so all notions of hierarchy, all notions of control either have to emerge from that atomistic level, or they are merely fictions. And it also follows from the schemes that what we call reality really depends on the observer. That is, how the atoms are configured, how the soul is interacting with them, and the illustrations Lucretius especially gives to make this convincing are the changing colors of the sea, how under one conditions of lighting or clouds or weather in general, it can look quite gray or greenish or silvery. And this must show that there is no color as such to the sea or the atoms composing it or to anything else. When we see an object, we are really seeing, Lucretius thought, in a sort of blurry way, the atoms that are composing it. The analogy he gives there is a flock of sheep on a distant hillside. It looks like a white blur, but there are individual sheep with spaces between them composing it. So another thing that follows is attrition from this model, since atoms are constantly being worn off or just flying off or being rubbed off. Everything is slowly disappearing that isn't being replenished. So more Lucretian poetry. Time wastes by use the ring upon our hands, the falling drop, the stone, the iron share grows thin by stealth in fields where furrows turn. The rock-paved streets are worn by passing feet. And this, again, is evidence for the composition of everything by atoms. But it's another reminder that everything is perishable, everything is temporary. And this is connected with a very important idea in Epicureanism, the doctrine of limits. There are natural limits to life, natural limits to the durability of anything, and there are ethical limits that Epicurus stressed to how much ambition is proper, how much wealth is proper, how much accumulation is proper, and in general to what people can do to other people that remains ethically acceptable. So coming to terms with these limits is really the center of Epicurean ethical philosophy. Now, theology. You might wonder, that's a sculpture of Zeus. Top part is missing, but that's a thunderbolt in Zeus's hand. You might wonder, if everything's made of atoms and compositions of atoms, what about the gods or a god? And here, I think there's a real difference between Epicurus and Lucretius. Epicurus said, people believe in gods. Verily, there are gods, and the knowledge of them is manifest, but they are not such as the multitude believe. And he encouraged his followers to believe that God is a living being, immortal and blessed, according to the notion of a God indicated by the common sense of mankind. That reference to the common sense of mankind is a phrase that was often used, and people said, "Now, why is there truth? Why is there justice? Why are there gods?" Well, it's just common sense, right? Every human being recognizes these things. It's the sensus communis of mankind. But what Epicurus really seemed to be encouraging his followers to do was to go along with the common practices of Greek religion, visit the temples and pray, but don't believe in Greek mythology as it was taught by the priests or by songs and stories or anything else. The gods, he said, they're off in another cosmos. They pay no attention to anything in this world. They didn't create it. They have nothing to do with it. They're just immortal, blessed, atomic, naturally, beings out there in their own perfect world. And the reason to even think about them at all is that you just hold them up in your mind as happy, contented beings who need nothing, which is the way we all ought to be. Lucretius was really much fiercer about religion. And I don't know whether he got this from one of those texts of Epicurus that was maybe lost in the eruption that we don't have, or whether he just had a different view of religion altogether. But he really took quite seriously that image of Epicurus smashing the dragon of superstition. He thought religion was really the root of cruelty and oppression and the terrorization of people who were taught to fear hell and fear eternal punishment. He thought that the basis for ethics had to lie in something other than fear of retribution in the afterlife. And at the beginning of On the Nature of Things, his poem, he tells the story of Iphigenia, sacrificed by her father Agamemnon to change the winds so that the fleet could sail to Troy and begin the Trojan War. And he says this is an example of what religion makes people do. The threats of hell terrify children, and motivation for honest conduct should be something quite different, namely that it facilitates relations with others and avoids resentment and retaliation. That's the basis of Epicurean ethics, nothing to do with commands coming down from above. So since there's no creator God or any kind of creator in Epicurean metaphysics, how did the animals and plants and everything else get there? Well, just through combinations of atoms, trial and error by nature over many, many eons. And in Lucretian poetry again, this was sometimes called by later philosophers the system of perishing. Darwin's grandfather referred to the system of perishing. So some of these combinations were stable. They composed animals that had the right limbs and organs for finding nourishment, finding mates, generating offspring. They survived, gave birth to other offspring, and eventually nature settled into a fixed habit of like producing like. This was sort of a priori a problem for them. Why would we expect sheep to produce other sheep and peacocks to produce other peacocks if it was just atoms shuffling around all the time? And as you can imagine, this was one of the major objections to Epicurean cosmology that opponents raised, that it just seemed completely improbable either that animals and plants could have come to be in the first place that way, or that they could perpetuate themselves in such a regular, orderly way. And Epicurus had a very hard time as well explaining why the seasons came and went on a regular basis, why the sun, moon, and stars underwent fairly regular patterns of motion. He was really not very good on that side of his science, but he said we just have to believe that it all happens according to atoms and their motion, along with volcanoes, earthquakes, tidal waves, the weather in general, and everything else. So we have a version of natural selection before Darwin. How must have perished then unnumbered tribes of animals that rose to light and sunk, unable to transmit life to their race? For all we see breathing the vital air with wiles or strength or fleetness is endowed. So many people have the idea that before Darwin, everybody was a creationist. Darwin came along and visited the Galapagos and compared the beaks of finches and came up with the theory of natural selection. And of course, that's completely wrong. This Lucretian account was in the knowledge of everyone who had a university education, because they all learned their Latin on Lucretius, on the nature of things, and they all would have been familiar with this system of perishing, right up to the time of Darwin. The problem, of course, was that this seemed completely speculative. There was no evidence for it. It simply followed a priori from the anti-theology and the atomism of Epicurus and Lucretius. So to become a scientific theory, that required observation and argument. So human beings, too, sprang out of the earth at some point, like all other animals. And like other ancient philosophers, the Greeks and Romans were very aware that people had not always lived in cities with kings and laws and buildings and things. I think Aristotle, who thought that there had always been humans, may have thought differently. But most Greek philosophers recognized that people had lived a tribal life and even a semi-wild life before civilization. So in Lucretius, this comes out as the theory that human beings had originally lived solitary lives, like solitary animals. They were very tough. They just lived out in all weathers and nourished themselves on acorns and other things that they found in the wild. And everything changed when first they began to band together for protection and to found families and to wear clothes. And this actually changed their personalities by living together with others and fathers living with children. They became more sentimental and more tender, and good qualities, good psychological qualities evolved in them. And this was the happiest period of the human race. But then something happened, and that is illustrated in this picture here. As the result of forest fires, which you see off in the distance up in the left where the birds are flying, metals, ores and rocks melted and ran out, and people realized that they could form these metals into whatever shape they wanted. And the first things they invented were weapons, tools of war, and agricultural implements, which became the tools of slavery. So with civilization came war and slavery, and as we know, all ancient cultures were organized on the basis of slavery, with a very few citizens in urban centers, that is. Rural life was somewhat different, and vast armies of people working in the fields, working in textile workshops, and not having, in most cases, terribly good lives. But the importance of prehistory for the Epicureans was to show that people invented culture without help from the gods, and to present an image of happiness outside of hierarchical society, and also to show how oppression and domination and the miseries of civilization had emerged from a very different state. So here's Lucretius's account of what happens. Soon property began, and wealth arose, and strength and beauty bound submiss to gold. But did right reason govern human life, sparing to live content were greater wealth, nor could poverty be where there are few desires, but men aspire to honor, fame, and power, which are, of course, the root of everything bad. So Lucretius is, in fact, very ambivalent about civilization. On one hand, he says it's given us navigation, architecture, city walls, laws, arms, clothing, and all other practical inventions, and every one of life's rewards and refinements, poems, pictures, and polished statues of exquisite workmanship, but with them the miseries of civilization and impotence in the face of nature. That comes at the end of Book 5 of On the Nature of Things. And Book 6, which is something of a puzzle for Lucretius scholars because it doesn't exactly seem to fit with the rest, and they wonder whether it was added on later. It starts out with a description of how the tiny particles are involved in the weather and produce thunderstorms and things like that. But it ends up very darkly. Here's an image of motives for war, actually belonging to my last slide: honor and fame and greed and ambition. This is a 16th century illustration. I think is interesting because of the way in which painting begins to reflect the appearance of Lucretius's translation in the 15th century. And art begins to take on social themes and themes of warfare, about which is critical, and also themes of pleasure, which I'll get onto in a minute. And ancient mythology becomes, of course, a subject for portraiture. So civilization, burning cities, we go from burning forests to burning cities. But back to Book 6 then. Book 6 then segues into an account of the plague of Athens of 430 BCE, so several centuries before. And it's sort of plagiarized from Thucydides, who described this. This was a fever somewhat like probably Ebola, a hemorrhagic fever that caused people to become, they started feeling sick, and a few hours later, they just collapsed in the street, covered with sores, and died. And this illustrates the power of the tiny toxic particles no one can see, composed of atoms, but against which humanity is helpless because they are there and you can't see them, you can't do anything about them, they are ubiquitous and carried through the air. But it seems that one reason Lucretius might have stuck on this sixth book was to use the illness of humanity as a metaphor for the sick state, which was another theme of ancient philosophy, and of which he was acutely aware because at the time Rome was torn by civil war. There was a lot of violence, mass executions, hangings on the Appian Way, all the way out of the city, and it was a very grim time, full of assassinations and unpredictability. So, back to Epicurean ethics. Epicurus said that physical well-being, absence of pain is really the most important value in human life. The cry of the flesh, not to be hungry, not to be thirsty, not to be cold. If someone has these things and is confident of having them in the future, he might contend even with Zeus for happiness. And here again, coming into iconography in 16th century are images of not just of freedom from cold, pain, and hunger, but of enjoyment. So here's an example from Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, slightly hallucinatory, like all of Bosch's work. He probably had ingested something or other, we think now. But here is somebody nibbling on a giant strawberry, and another pair of people enjoying themselves with something quite lush. And here an illustration of Cranach the Elder, just a little bit later, of the Golden Age. It was not only Lucretius who described a golden age, many ancient poets did. But what's quite striking about this, I think, is that you see men and women getting along very nicely, and nobody seems to be particularly stressed out about anything. Nobody is wearing any clothes. They're just living in this rather paradisical surroundings, which obviously bore comparison with the Garden of Eden, except that rather than Eve's temptation and Adam's sin being the cause of downfall, the Epicureans had this more complicated story of how discovery of fire gradually produced the miseries of civilization and oppression. So for happiness, one needs at least freedom from deprivation, even though daily life for many people is exactly in our world deprivation, or at least precariousness. But this emphasis on pleasure is not really stressed by many philosophers. And in my book, I give a list of all the things that the great and the good have said against pleasure. Pleasure is dangerous, pleasure is the root of all evil, virtue is opposed to pleasure, so on and so forth. And all forms of martyrdom and asceticism, as Freud pointed out, are typically seen as holy and virtuous. So Epicurus was out on a limb here and certainly suffered a lot of criticism for it. The next topic is mortality. So Epicurus said, death is nothing to us, does not affect us. As long as you exist, you are not dead. If you're dead, you don't exist. So there's nothing that it's like to be dead, and it can't possibly be bad for you to be dead. This, I think, has struck most people as something of a sophism, because that isn't the problem about death. The problem isn't that you're dead and you're having a problem being dead. It's that you are going to be missing out, and that you're going to cause a lot of trouble and grief to other people. And the Epicureans do actually go beyond this rather facile claim about why it isn't bad to be dead. That point about it not being bad to be dead, though, did have a point, namely, you are not going to hell. You are not going to heaven either. There is just going to be nothing. It's going to be like either good or bad. But what they stress is the idea of the natural limit. It's bad to have your life cut off when you're young or middle-aged, or even when you're quite old but in very good health and still enjoying life. But it's not bad to lose your life at around the natural limit for human life. By then, Epicurus said, your senses are fading, your vision is fading, your hearing is going, you're wearing out. And if you have lived a full and happy life, you shouldn't leave with too many regrets. It's like leaving a feast where you've really enjoyed yourself, but now you feel like it's time to go. This may not satisfy everyone worried about death, but if you actually go back and read those passages of Lucretius, they really are quite consoling, I think, as much as what the Stoics have to say. So I think I have just a couple more slides here. Here's one about handing on the torch of life, again connected with mortality. Mortals live by mutual exchange, some wax, some wane, thus generations change. And like to runners in the Grecian game, bear for a brief time, and then to others pass the lamp of life, their hands are forced to yield. So the idea is life is something you enjoy, take part in, maybe even struggle a bit with, for a brief time, and then you hand it on to the next generation. And now it's theirs to run the race with. So as we now realize, we hand on not just life, not just our property and our money, as advertisers are always informing us, but as we are now increasingly realizing, I think, we hand on a world of institutions and practices and assumptions. And these change for the Epicureans. Remember, nothing is permanent. The physical world is changing very rapidly, and our laws and institutions change to keep up with that and need to change to keep up with that. So finally, Epicureans versus Stoics. I think most people are more familiar, really, with Stoicism than Epicureanism. And one reason is perhaps that Epicureanism lends itself to explanation in terms of this whole system, starting with the atoms. Whereas when you learn about Stoicism, you learn about it essentially as an ethical philosophy of forbearance. The Stoics think miseries and evils will come upon you no matter what, but especially as part of public life, and you just have to resign yourself to your losses, and according to them, you can always do this because the mind always has control over the emotions and can choose not to be affected by external circumstances. The mind for the Stoics is an internal citadel which is absolutely impregnable. And Epicureans didn't think that at all. For one thing, they didn't think the mind and body were really separate in the same way. Remember, the mind is just atomic and pervades the body. And they didn't think that repressing your emotions was really what you ought to be doing. For Stoics like Seneca, all the emotions are bad, even pity. Pity's bad because you kind of have a bad feeling when you're pitying someone, when you see them in, with their legs cut off or something. You have a sort of bad reaction to that, and that's something you should avoid. So stay away from situations that will make you feel pity is a Stoic piece of advice. So the Epicureans argue with those who eliminate pains and tears, namely the Stoics, for the death of friends, and they say that the kind of freedom from pain which amounts to insensitivity is the result of another and greater bad thing, savagery or an unadulterated lust for fame and madness. Good. So, summarizing here, what Epicureanism is not. A dedication to fine dining. That's what the term has become. But the original teaching of Epicurus was that really a little bit of bread and cheese and some water were really all you needed. He said, you don't need wines, you don't need fish, apparently a delicacy in ancient Greece, and really content yourself with these simple things. So there's kind of a long story to be told about how Epicureanism became associated. This mostly happened in the 18th century with decadence and consumption and gluttony and so on. So consumerism as well. The sources of happiness in the Epicurean school were sensory pleasures, Epicurus says the pleasures of taste and hearing, very important. Sex, he mentioned, that created a scandal. What other ancient philosopher ever said that? Not for thousands of years. But also, I think you have to look at what the Epicureans did, not only at what they said. And I think what Epicurus thought was the most pleasurable thing in life, really, was learning new things and thinking up new theories and trying to explain things, to understand things and explain them. Well, that's certainly what he devoted his life to doing with his 57 books, or whatever the number was. And for Lucretius, what gave him pleasure? Well, obviously writing this incredibly beautiful poem in 6 books, which is still a model of Latin prose and is full of absolutely luscious nature imagery. The life of animals, talks about a lot, and living nature, plants, flowers, the cosmos. So really worth reading. And this is the other thing that I think really gives people pleasure is the arts, practicing crafts, practicing composition, writing. And I would stress that as well as the sensory pleasures that both of them mention. So that is really the end of my talk. If you're interested in pursuing any of these topics, you've probably heard of Stephen Greenblatt's book, The Swerve. I think it's slightly mistitled because the swerve, that's supposed to be the random motion of the atoms that makes their behavior unpredictable and that gives rise to all the unpredictability in the world and even to human free will somehow. But Epicurus only mentions the swerve once. I don't think Lucretius pays very much attention to it. So it's not really central to Epicurean philosophy, even though it's important. On one side there, I have my book about Epicureanism and its influence in the 17th century, and the latest one that Anouar mentioned, How to Be an Epicurean, that has just come out last week. Over there on the right. So thank you very much, and I'll be very happy to answer your questions at this point.